Current estimates reveal that nearly 690 million people are hungry, or 8.9% of the world's population. The nutritional status of the most vulnerable population groups has deteriorated further due to the health and socio-economic impacts of COVID-19. The world is not on track to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of zero hunger by 2030. If recent trends continue, the number of people affected by hunger would surpass 840 million by 2030. Earlier this month, the Nobel Committee turned the global spotlight on hunger by awarding the Nobel Peace Prize to the World Food Programme, which is the food assistance branch of the United Nations, for its effort to combat hunger, for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace in conflict-affected areas, and for acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict. Hunger is not only seen in developing countries alone. Every community in the United States is home to families who struggle with food insecurities, including rural and suburban communities. As closures and social distancing orders meant to limit the spread of the novel coronavirus extends across the country, the impact is being felt in communities large and small. Households with children are more likely to experience food insecurity. Many households that experience food insecurity do not qualify for federal nutrition programs and need to rely on their local food banks and other hunger relief organizations for support. To discuss the issue, we speak today with Rayna Andrews, who is a passionate entrepreneurial servant leader with more than 15 years of civil service. Rayna is the founder of the Healthy Food Movement, a food literacy initiative focused on solving preventative health disparities for our next generation. She also serves as the Senior Director of the Community Engagement and Partnerships for Feeding America, Eastern Wisconsin. As the Senior Director, Rayna develops strategies to feed the hungry and initiatives to address the root causes of poverty in diverse counties across Eastern Wisconsin. Ms. Andrews is focused on improving people's lives, advancing health equity, and driving change in the food system. She is well known and respected for her work across the state of Wisconsin. She served as the regional lead on the state of Wisconsin's Emergency Feeding Task Force. She has convened healthcare networks to pilot healthy food prescription programs and has organized citizen science groups to galvanize systems change at the neighborhood level. She is currently working on a regional technology integration solution to further support data-driven decision-making throughout the food system. In her spare time, Rayna enjoys sharing her latest book, Alex Migreen and the Tale of the Mysterious Kale, in virtual classrooms and libraries across the United States and Caribbean. Her book can be found at healthyfoodmovement.com and Amazon. Ms. Andrews holds a Master of Urban Planning from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and a Bachelor of Journalism from the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. Welcome, Rayna.
Thank you for inviting me to share what we're seeing in the food system, Ashwin and Alex.
Feeding America, the nation's largest hunger relief organization, says more than 54 million people in the country could soon face food insecurity. That is 17 million more than before the coronavirus outbreak. The nonprofit has seen 60% increase in food assistance needs since March. Rayna, if you could please discuss from your experience the impact of COVID-19 on food insecurity and hunger to start the conversation.
Feeding America National Office is the national organization that supports nearly 200 affiliates across the country. So once you've seen one food bank, you've only seen one food bank. But I think there's archetypes and personas and ways of performance that we're all seeing themes of across the country. And with COVID-19, what I think we would all echo is that what we're seeing are symptoms of what was already kinks in the armor in the food system. And so we've gone from rapidly needing to collect data to manage who is actually still functioning. We've gone to doing direct service, as our food banks typically would do outreach through a network of food pantries, hot meal programs, and shelters, who would actually drive or service the client, or as some would call the neighbor. And so what we're seeing is the food banks, the food pantries, hot meal programs, and the federal government all coming together like never before in this moment of crisis to really be the community's response. Who we're seeing in the food pantry and soup kitchen lines and in the shelters are very different from who we've traditionally seen. Who we traditionally were seeing were the seniors who were experiencing chronic hunger, meaning that they were on a fixed income and they would go to the pantry to either supplement their income, or we'd see episodic, where that man or woman lost their job and so they just needed some support for a very temporary point of time. Now, who we're seeing are those who are being furloughed, those who particularly were in the restaurant and barring industry, who no longer have their jobs because their restaurants can't open due to COVID. We're seeing a rise in the types of foods that people eat. Typically, people would have anything or really not have any dietary restrictions. But now what we're seeing are people who are vegan or who look for plant-based or who were vegetarian, which was very rare in terms of what was being requested before.
No, it's really insightful how you've shared the impact of COVID and how that has really magnified the problem with food insecurity and nutrition in the community. I think this question is kind of like a lead up to that, is what are everyday challenges that organizations like Feeding America and other global organizations face when battling or trying to solve hunger and food insecurity?
I think a number of feeding organizations are in the same boat. And so this is not just for Feeding America, but there's a such thing as doing the right thing for too long, right? And what I mean by that is when you mention the World Food Program, there's a natural disaster in Haiti, there's an earthquake, so you send a lot of rice. There's a natural disaster in Africa, there's a natural disaster in California, there's a natural disaster in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And what we have a tendency to do as a nation globally is to infuse resources into that community, not thinking about the toxic charity that creates. And so that local rice producer can no longer support their local economies because of our good deeds pouring into that community. And I say that's synonymous to what happens around the world, particularly in local communities, is that doing the right thing too long could show up as doing what we thought was right instead of engaging other partners in that community, focusing so closely on our goal and not looking up and looking at how that affects other people. Another thing that I would say are trends or things that we should take a look at in the food system is how we define things. Even in this conversation, we use hunger because it resonates with people. People can understand hunger.
Sure.
However, we can't actually solve hunger. Yeah, I said it. We can't actually solve hunger because hunger is an individual symptom, right? We're all at Thanksgiving dinner and it takes too long to get our food. So we have sensations of being hungry. I call them hangry, right? Because you become angry because you've waited too long. But if, as a network, if we start using the same language on what we're really trying to do, which is address food insecurity and remove barriers to accessing food, then we have language to move together. But we're not even all talking about the same thing. And my last point to this question is that when we talk about solving or addressing hunger, I think the big misnomer is that hunger starts from the point of food donation to food received. That's not the case. Hunger is a symptom of an overarching issue within our food system. So it goes from seed to how we even secure our heirlooms, our seeds, and how we plant and how we mass produce, to how we offer a fair trade to migrant workers, to how many times our food is touched, to retail pricing, to consumer food waste. All of that defines our food system, because that'll inform whether the farmer who we've relied on for the last 30 years to grow our food is now having to join the food pantry line because they can't afford what they grow because of price gouging, or the migrant workers who are actually trafficked, right? Having policies and regulations that look at the full system, because also overproduction moving down the Delta into the Gulf, it creates now this system that's a hybrid or breeding ground for hurricanes and toxic waste. And so, I mean, we have to look at everything that we do within the food system. And I think as a global community, we would be short-sighted just looking at the food system as a logistics operation from the point of food receipted from the retail donor to the dinner table.
Wow, this is really insightful, Rayna. And I think it actually just leads me to an additional question that you touched on as part of the socio-political challenges that organizations face. I think you touched on climate change a little bit. Mm-hmm. Do you want to expand on that piece?
I absolutely do. So when you look at the plans to solve hunger by 2030, we had a plan to solve hunger by 2020. And a lot of what I touched on, unless there is policy change, this is never going to happen, because something allows for the mass production and overproduction of goods, right? The overproduction of animals. Well, our policies in setting tariffs with other countries, not being able to trade, has a very adverse effect on our ability to stimulate our own local economies. I think if we don't have informed, first of all, the appropriate data that's not tainted, and informed decision-making on how our historical decisions have affected our socio-economical health economy, I think we will be misguided moving into the future. And if we hunger fighters think that we're going to do this alone, just from the global feeding organizations, our local food banks, and our local food pantries, we're short-sighted, because what we're finding is on the other side that those same outlets that we were relying on food resources are changing the game. They're changing the game without us. Because when you go to the grocery store, you see the grocers, they've gotten savvy and marking down prices, right? And then it's the last run. So meat that was maybe $5 is now $1.35. And so that $1.35, which is at the very bottom of its shelf life, is now being donated to our food banking system. Just imagine how much shelf life is left. And that goes for produce, that goes for a whole nother gamut of food. So now food banks are having to pivot to figure out, well, how am I going to diversify the sources, the quality, the quantity, the variety of food that we're able to offer the food insecure populations we serve with dignity? So that's what I'll say about that, is that we have to make more informed decision-making on our policies that affect the human population, their health, their welfare, and their socially economic ways of being. Because if we don't, people won't get the food that they need, because we're constantly operating in silos and aloof to what's happening on the other side. That's a lot.
It was enlightening, Rayna. To our viewers, we will provide the link to the TEDx talk that Rayna had provided. And even in the talk, you mentioned this about changing the narrative. So we always, the misconceptions that people have about, many of the misconceptions you just clarified for us. In terms of marketing, there's a lot of marketing about end hunger, solve hunger. But rather than that, how can we increase awareness by having any other different type of language that will replace the word hunger?
I think hunger is a buzzword. It's something that resonates with people. So I'm not saying it's wrong, but I think where we fall short is thinking that that's enough. right? Because some people, when you say that together we can solve hunger, many people don't believe that we can actually solve hunger, because in the length and span of human existence, hunger has never been solved, right? So what do you mean? In 2020, we're now going to solve it, or by 2030, we're now going to solve it. And so I think using hunger as a carrot to pique people's interest, but draw them closer to what we mean. And there's been a big movement, a big push to further educate people on the term food insecurity, which is based on a household socioeconomic level that determines if the household has had access to healthy and safe food within a 12-month period of time. I think there have been gallant efforts to work with healthcare providers, doctors, nurse practitioners, to ask the two-part food insecurity questionnaire and to be more sensitive to their patients. So there's been a lot of training there. And I think there's been great efforts to further define what we mean by solving hunger. But I think, I don't think we've done a really good job of bringing in the public to help us solve this problem. Because like I say in the TEDx, that it's so much bigger than food people focusing on food issues. It's so much bigger than education people or academia focusing on academia, or violence prevention, or economic development, healthcare. And so we all operate in these silos. And if we don't break out and to identify together what is the strategy we're going to take, but first, how are we defining this problem? We're never going to get there, because we're all focused on our own silos, not realizing or acknowledging the complexity and the intersectionality of all of our work.
That's a great point, Rayna, on complexity and intersectionality. And I think that leads me to the next question about leadership in global nutrition and food security. In global health overall, there is always this notion that there is a lack of women leadership in global health. And I think that even extends to underrepresented populations, for lack of a better term. So do you think that also obtains in nutrition in the US and globally? And what would be your recommendations for that?
Absolutely. I think a diversity in leadership across the spectrum would produce a diversity in thinking and approach. So even when you look at the food banking system across the country, I think we've done a good job of balancing, whereas predominantly men, now it's teetering with more women. But when you look at women of color, particularly African-American, women who look like me, very few are in senior leadership roles. And I don't think, we used to have an African-American CEO, female CEO in New York, but now we don't have any across the country. And for me, that's a big problem when you look at the food insecure populations, because I think what diversity in gender and ethnicity and sexual orientation and religion, you just bring a different global perspective that allows for enhanced cultural sensitivities. So like, for example, for our food bank, what I'm able to offer is the lens of cultural appropriateness of food. When you talk about diet nutrition, it doesn't start and end by the suggested my plate, right? It's about what are the current health norms that African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, what are the eating norms that they look for, and being sensitive to those and trying to source for those within the food bank. Because if all we're producing is summer squash, things that are very Midwestern, things that are a part of the diet that we're familiar with, I think it's unthoughtful and inconsiderate to think that other people should be eating such as you. I think that's another form of toxic charity. And frankly, maybe even a lens of gaslighting to think that someone should be grateful to receive the foods that you would enjoy. You've heard of the golden rule, right? Treat people how you would want to be treated. I've upgraded to the platinum rule. Treat people how they want to be treated. It's okay to get in other people's world, even when you're serving them, especially when you're serving them.
That was a really good one. Really, it's enlightening. So, what does success look like? And again, I know you touched on a couple of points there, but can you maybe share some few examples of organizations demonstrating success in this light?
Yeah, I think even the way that the organizations are set up. So when you think of, I'll start with food banking and then go backwards. So within food banking, you the pay wage gap even exists here, where women make a fraction of what men make. And even when you look at the salaries of men and women and how they are pretty volatile, when you look at the historical positions that women will hold versus men. You know, in food banking, we have concrete versus carpet, right? Where the women are on the carpet side working very administrative roles. And, you know, how dare a woman ask if she can get a forklift license? Why do you need one? And then you have all the male workers, either, I hate the fact I even said workers, team members that operate on order fulfillment and on the forklifts navigating product throughout the warehouse and driving the trucks to and from distribution centers. And so that's a very sexist perspective. It's falling into traditional gender norms. I think I'm proud to say that we do have a female director of operations, which I find to be rare across the country. But even when we look at the food system, there is this very patriarchal way of being in the food system in terms of who can even speak for the food system, the roles. When you even look at farming, traditionally you very rarely see a female farmer or a female taking the lead of anything dealing with farming at a large scale, unless it's backyard gardening, right? And so all of this really plays a role in how decisions are made. And I think I'm very proud that we have a female CEO that has had a diversity of living experiences from the urban, rural to suburban that can speak to the entire family and the entire household. And so that's what I mean by having the diversity of thinking, especially with gender and race and just social cultural.
Yeah, no, that's really insightful. I think really expanding on that success piece is, do you mind sharing a couple of organizations or maybe other food banks within Feeding America's system that you would regard as bright spots, and what do you think their secret sauce is?
Yes, so there is the Food Share Institute for Hunger Research and Solutions in Connecticut. Um, Katie and her team, Katie is the CEO, her last name escapes me, but they are doing phenomenal work. What I was hired 5 years ago to do is really to lead the SOLVE initiative for Feeding America Eastern Wisconsin. They've developed a whole research institute to not only gather information, to develop food pantry archetypes, to pilot food as medicine as a way of being while testing their theories in community through food distribution. So they're constantly evolving, and they're far beyond the point of being transactional and have moved to relational, in addition to being nimble and able to pivot when their hypothesis or their theories are not landing well in community. And that's, again, when I said in the opening statement that there's a such thing as doing the right thing for too long. For you, it was the right thing, but failing to ever test the impact of your process in community, I think, is the most toxic thing we could be doing as a system. So I think Food Share is doing it phenomenally in Connecticut. I recently had an opportunity to work with them on a national feeding group. I would also say the San Diego Food Bank is doing a lot of phenomenal work on targeted programming with children and seniors, the two most vulnerable populations. I think the New Orleans Food Bank is doing a lot of great work with tiering. As we say, once you see one food bank, one food pantry, you've only seen one food pantry, that they're very different. They've done some really interesting things with tiering food pantries to identify how do you focus staff time to focus on the growing needs of food pantries, to infuse and help them develop their strengths and their networks and their deliverables. And I'd also have to say, you know, I'm from the great state of Texas, from Houston, Texas, that the Greater Houston Food Bank, by far in my mind, is doing phenomenal work. I had an opportunity to spend some time out there last year, or actually earlier this year, and the stuff that they're doing, the way that they're servicing the entire state and working cooperatively across food banks, I think is huge. The direct distribution model to clients, partnering with organizations like Amazon and Uber, doing some really revolutionary things, I think is awe-inspiring. I would also say what's happening on the municipal level with the hiring of food czars, like Madison, Wisconsin has a food czar, or also known as director of policy. I know Baltimore has a food czar. All of that is very inspiring, and Johns Hopkins University is doing a lot of research on the development of food czars and how public and private organizations can come together to create civil solutions, because it's not just the nonprofit's responsibility. It's not just government's responsibility. It's not on the private sector. It's this collective impact that we have to come together to solve this very complex problem.
How can we encourage that kind of a bottom-up approach? Because from this conversation, I'm learning that most of the solutions, the bad solutions, are mostly top-down approach, rather than, as you said, your example on we need to treat people the way they need to be treated. And to do that, my understanding is that we need to have their voices also in the boardrooms and the conference calls, and have their perspectives as well to, partner with them. It's not only public-private partnerships, but looks like there's also the community voice and bringing their voice as well to the solutions. Can you talk a little bit around that, Light?
Absolutely. So I talked about silos before, right?
Yeah.
And so you have to follow the money. The reason I think that we have so many silos is due to this lack mentality that, well, if I don't get the grant, you shouldn't get the grant. Or if I know about this opportunity, I'm not going to collaborate with you because then the light's going to be on you, as if your program's more relevant than I. And so what I've noticed is that a number of funders had been taking a very directive approach, as if they're the experts, as if they're doing the work in this field, and they can direct the way that money should be spent. And very few times will a funder say, hey, use this as you see fit, or use this for operational purposes. It's always program specific, not remembering or not considering the whole band of staff that you need to actually run this operation that's doing the great work in your community. And so I think if as a system we pivoted, and instead of the funders taking a more directive approach and played the role of a convener and brought all these pieces together and said, folks, we have a problem. We've spent billions of dollars on this problem. We got to solve this. Not only do we need to feed it, but now we need to focus on how do we feed the line and shorten the line, because this can't continue. And in the role of convener, you can force those food banks, those food pantries, those shelters who've maybe been at war with each other to now work together, because the incentive is that the money's not just going to you. The money is going to all of you, all of us, to make a systemic change. I think that when you talk about changing the narrative, I think that paradigm shift in thinking will effectively change the game, because I don't doubt that there are enough resources to address this problem. I think there's a lack of coordination and interest in working together. And I think money is the big incentivizer of all of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's really insightful, Rayna. And I think just piggybacking off of that, you mentioned paradigm shift. I think we all know that, of course, the solution to ending food insecurity is really a paradigm shift and a change in the way we think and a change in the narrative, like you said. You had mentioned your experience in the Caribbean, and I think a couple of places also outside of the US. Do you think these lessons and these recommendations that you've provided obtain in the global scene also, or do you think there are some nuances?
I think it's both. I think this notion, so when I was in the Bahamas and when I was in Cuba, two very different systems. I think the embargo in Cuba still has such nasty effects on the economy and the way that they do social welfare programs, right? So I'll start off with the Caribbean. There are two major food banks in the Greater Bahamas, Nassau area. And both of them are rifting because they don't believe that one belongs in the same space or should exist. But the biggest difference is their philosophies. One believes in food reverting from the landfill to the dinner plates because it's still great food. You know, the Bahamas is a very high tourist economy. And so diverting all of the food from those cruise ships onto the dinner plate of the hungry Bahamians is one thing. But another one is thinking, well, we want to raise funds and work directly with local grocers and local farmers to get the best products. So the insult is, well, you're reducing waste and giving households waste. And another is like, well, we need to raise more money and produce more food and put it on the dinner table. So it's two very different philosophies, which is reflective to exactly the rifts that happen in local communities in the United States. And the good news is that we need them both. We just need you to stop fighting to think that your solution is the right one. But I do also want to speak to my time in Cuba. Most of my time was in Havana, but I got a chance to go to the closed circuit pharmacies and go to their farming communities. And in Cuba, the families have rations that they get on a monthly basis. And most of their lifestyle is controlled by the government and very limited vegetation. You have a lot of root vegetables, a lot of salted fish. You get one chicken, one thing of oil. And I remember going to a grocery store in Havana, and as we have overstimulated marketing where we have 20 different varieties of ketchup, they had one thing ketchup, one thing cola, one thing mustard. And when you think about their way of living, is that their whole system works for them. It's not something I would advocate for the United States, but in terms of choice, the choice is very limited in what you get. And it's kind of you get what you get. And so I think there's so much that we can learn from a global classroom and from a global society, that the way that we're doing it here in the United States is good in the fact that we're considering that there's another way to do things, and that what we've been doing for the last 30 to 75 years has really not been serving us to the best of our ability, and to really start changing the game from a global perspective.
One thing I really admire about you, Rayna, is that you think different and also think far distant, and especially your the interest to take this kind of proper narrative to the next generation, because that kind of a narrative should be formed from the young, from the childhood itself, so that really they have proper notions about these social issues. I'm talking about elementary school students and middle school students. And one book, a book that you have written, The Tale of the Alex McGreen and The Tale of the Mysterious Cane. What inspired you to write that book? And why is it important that children must know about the proper perspective to look at the food system?
I should have had it here, but here's Alex McGreen, The Tale of the Mysterious Kale. Wisconsin and the Great Lakes, particularly Milwaukee, is known as the freshwater capital of the world. Did you know that?
Wow.
Yes. We are based right in the midst of Lake Michigan, in the Great Lakes in the Midwest. And what prompted me to write this book is that in the city of Milwaukee, there had been a lot of public works activity with replacing the lateral sewage lines. And much of the piping in the underground lateral lines were laced and filled with lead. And so as all that banging and replacement was happening, there was a lot of lead that flooded our waterways. And a lot of children and family were testing positive for lead poisoning. And so during that crisis is when I was also pregnant with my now 3-year-old son. And I was doing a lot of community outreach because I'm always looking for the holistic alternative rather than providing medicine, right? Formal drugs. As to could food really be medicine in this space? And so we were bringing a lot of kale. We were bringing a lot of dark leafy vegetables to help draw out a lot of these toxins in our body that regular vitamins and regular medicine could not do. And so I remember being at health fairs and having vast varieties of vegetation that we're just giving away and additional water filters. And we saw that the older adults were only taking the apples and oranges and maybe the celery, things that they were familiar with. But as soon as I brought the blender out and put in kale and apples and spinach and allowed the young people to touch them, this was pre-COVID, right? You're not touching vegetables now and putting them in the blender. They got excited about it. They felt connected and a part of that movement. And when they tried it, they had never tried kale before. They would never eat celery before, but when they tried it, they liked it and they wouldn't even try it before. And I said, boy, if I could get young people excited and could see the science and to reframe their intimate connection with food, how powerful could that be? And so Alex McGreen in The Tale of the Mysterious Kale is about a 10-year-old girl who saves her 5th grade science class with kale because they're all sent home because there's lead that's been found in their water system. And so this is definitely where where fiction meets reality.
Sure.
I know that was really, really powerful. I was actually thinking, how do you get the book? Because I have to get that for my kids.
Well, you can go to thehealthyfoodmovement.com. And if you order directly from me, I have a promotion and they're on sale right now. When you order them directly from me, you can also put in your kid's name where I can autograph it for you.
Oh, that's they would love that. And is that available for international shipping also?
Absolutely. And you can also find it on Amazon. You won't get the same deal, and it's through my publisher, but yeah, if you could just share the link. We'll
definitely share the link. So along those lines, what advice do you have for people who are on the field, who are practitioners in that field of, food insecurity and hunger, and then just students generally on how to combat this issue?
So those are 2 questions. So folks who are already in the field, I would challenge us to see ourselves as public health ambassadors,
right.
That this is not just a logistical problem, that is way more complex than that. Logistics is a really big part of it because we have all the resources we need and we need to figure out how to get it from point A to point B, but start looking at this problem from a global perspective. How are our efforts affecting our local communities, our neighborhoods, our cities, our states, and who else should be at the table? And I would say that who else should be at the table from the lens of a layperson who is not in the food system, someone who may be in the health field, someone who may be in the education or local politics. I would look around and say, who else is not at this table and what else should be served here? I would encourage those who are interested in this food space to volunteer at the local food bank, at the local food pantry. We're always looking for people to lend a hand. If you didn't know that when we talk about the network, it's not very sophisticated. We're always looking for succession plans. The average food pantry is volunteer-based in the basement of a church where with a little old lady who drives a Buick or an Oldsmobile or even a Prius. And that is such a stereotype. But when you think about it, it's the older generation who volunteers because that is their ministry. But what this system is calling for is for the younger generation to step forward and to galvanize and lead this change and transformation. But that's difficult to happen when the system doesn't even know that a transition is required.
In terms of educating ourselves further in this subject, could you share any resources that are available to learn more about the food insecurity prevalence or insecurity, or how how people can respond or?
Yes, so there's a book called Food Policy.
Okay.
I would highly recommend it. And you know what? I should have had my stack of books here so I could show you what they look like.
Okay.
So you can find it. It's on Audible. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. It's called Food Policy.
Okay.
And has the red tomatoes and a barcode on it. But that really talks about our food system and how food policies and regulations are not set up for us. That the USDA and the MyPlate and that whole system is in cahoots with
Right.
the big food industry. And I think that's really eye-opening and produced by a professor, I think out of UNC Chapel Hill, or let me not get to storytelling here,
Sure.
but food policy is one that you definitely want to look into. Another book that I absolutely love is Toxic Charity. That's a really good one, and one that I pulled the example of rice to Haiti and disturbing local economies. Toxic Charity is a wake-up call for the good that we do to ensure that it's really doing more good than harm. Another book that I'd recommend is The Black Farmer Movement by Dr. Monica White. She's out of University of Wisconsin-Madison. She cites the journey of Fannie Lou Hamer. And I think one of the folks who I admire the most is Fannie Lou Hamer, who is a civil rights activist that very few people know. In the 60s and 70s, she created a closed loop farming system where she got together 75 farmers on 125 acres of land, and they had their own closed kind of co-op where you had people who grew food, people who had different jobs within this co-op, and they all lived together. And so I think really learning the story of the Black Farmer Movement and how few of Black farmers we have today and the role that our federal government played in that, I think learning that from historical context is very helpful. Oh, wow. And in the last book, so I'm also a plant-based vegan. And what really nudged me to that place is Russell Simmons' book, Happy Vegan.
Okay.
The Happy Vegan.
Okay.
And the reason why I recommend that book is that he highlights a lot of overproduction and the way that we treat animals and the way that we treat environment to help us look at the bigger picture of our food system. Ooh, The Good Food Revolution by Will Allen. He's a local farmer here, former NBA player,
Okay.
who's taken on local farming and the farmers market movement.
Mhm.
I know this may sound out of pocket, but White Fragility is one that I'd highly recommend because most of the leaders in the food banking space are white. There are very few people of color. And I think there is a challenge to the system and to understand the fragility that exists to share why there's a necessity for diversity in people and a diversity in thinking. There's a level of fragility and a status quo that you'll be up against when you try and reframe or change anything in the system that's been predominantly led by non-people of color. And also I'd look to the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks, who often talked about the champion in the common folk, the folk in the local neighborhoods that weren't widely celebrated. It is through her work and through her poetry that she helps tell a very different story in such a beautiful way. She's right up there with Maya Angelou,
Okay.
Vicky Giovanni.
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah. She was once a poet laureate of the United States, right?
Yes.
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 Yeah.
Another one is Charity Detox by Robert Lupton, Lupton. Bridges Out of Poverty. Ooh, The New Jim Crow is another book. When you talk about intersectionality, you also have to think about the large population that are incarcerated and that are being newly introduced to society, and the impacts and effects of our federal policies that disable them from getting jobs or starting their own businesses. And in that book, it talks about a policy where the formerly incarcerated or the newly re-entered into society can't get barbering licenses. Like, that's a skill set that seems to be pretty racially targeted for a specific population who are known for being barbers. They can't even start their own businesses. They can't vote. They can't apply for food stamps. They can't apply for a lot of public benefits. So when you think about what else isn't being served on the table, to start asking questions like, if the formerly incarcerated, the newly reintroduced to society, cannot create a new quality of life for themselves after they've served their time, after they've been rehabilitated, as they say, how do you expect them to not go back to the system that they were once in? So when we talk about crime and violence in communities, I think as a system, that's something that we should also be looking at. The socio-political climate has a very big impact on hunger in America. When we think of the populations, can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
When we think of the populations that are experiencing chronic hunger, those who rely on the food system to supplement their income and their quality of life, I think of seniors and the billions of seniors that face hunger each year. Not billions, and millions of seniors that face hunger each year. And a lot of it comes down to the social welfare catchment, the changes in Social Security, the changes in Medicare, Medicaid. And when folks don't get the economic resources, the health resources that they need, that burden falls somewhere. And I think we as a people have to consider, and this isn't me being political, but people's health and well-being is very political. And the decisions that'll come out of this next election will very much be a driver on if people can survive when taxes are raised, not only on people in the workforce, but also on big companies. It's like, it's one thing when you saw Tesla that said, you know what, forget this, I'm moving to Texas, where I'm not taxed nearly as much, that I think we'll see big corporations actually picking up industries and relocating across the country. And you saw how tragic that was for Michigan, and looking at Detroit and the big motor states. And so I feel like our economy is so cyclical. And at some point, when the economy is at its lowest, a certain population wins. And when the economy is at its highest, a certain population wins. So I just think that people need to be civically engaged and consider how their vote, not only for a national presidency, but especially in their local states, who's running for governor, who's running for Senate, who's running for their state representatives even, all makes a difference on local economies and our quality of life.
Absolutely. That's quite an important citizen duty that you just highlighted. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that reminder.
There's so many other resources, but those are the ones that really come top of mind. Most of those books can be found on Amazon. Most of them can be found on Audible, not to promote one source, but I have all of those books in both formats.
So do you think goals like SDG 2, Zero Hunger by 2030 work? Are they relevant?
What I would say about that is that I think if we do not look at this from a global perspective and really start drawing from lessons learned at the neighborhood level, because again, I think one, we have to have a unified way of how are we defining this problem. What I do like about SDG 2 is that they're looking at it from the lens of food sovereignty. So from the seed to the plate, and how our decisions affect everyone in between. And I did see a couple calls for proposals, and a number of organizations that I know in the food system have been called to participate in the United Nations study and moving forward with solutions, which I think is amazing. But I think we talk about food system, it's really starts with short food systems. It starts in our urban centers. It starts in our suburban communities. It starts in our rural communities. And this one solution is not going to carry the day. We have to develop tools for local communities to be the change that they need within their communities. And so I think once we start looking at where that change is actually going to happen and how we foster a pivot within those spaces is where we're going to see the needle move. And having the technology to measure, did we move the needle? Because mind you, our food system is not sophisticated, and that a number of folks are still using pen and paper, Excel spreadsheets, and that's what I'm working on here locally, is how do we leverage technology to capture the data that informs us of the real problem and if we're moving the needle.
Sure. So, in the United States, we have a lot of college students who have, when they start their college, they're undecided majors. Mm-hmm. And, when we ask them, are you interested in social issues? Are you interested in healthcare? They would say, yeah, I'm interested, but I don't know what I need to do to get there. Or, so for them, what are the kinds of pathways they need to take so that they can be in leadership roles in food system, in solving, or not solving, I want to change my narrative, in fixing the food system? What are the kinds of careers they need to be in? For example, should they major in economics, social studies, or literary arts, or they can major in any subject, but then do these particular internships and fellowships? Could you advise around that area as well?
I would say, and this is my opportunity to toot the horn for our food bank, Feeding America Eastern Wisconsin. I think we're progressive in the set that we remove the education criteria from a lot of our positions at our food bank. The reason why is that the most valuable people are those who have life experiences that can relate to the populations that we serve, who can do the work, who can challenge our current system. And so for those in school, like my pathway to becoming the Senior Director of Community Engagement and Partnerships, 6 years ago, I never saw myself in the food banking space. I was like, I didn't even know what a food bank was, to be honest with you. I heard of it, but I wasn't distinguishing food bank from food pantry, and I didn't know nearly as much as I know about the food system. So I went from journalism, broadcast, to public relations, to urban planning, to commercial real estate, to government affairs, to food banking. And so that's a testament that work your ministry, work your passion, and allow that to lead you to food banking, to our food system.
Sure.
Because your external personal experiences is what's really going to help support the drive and the change within the system.
That is really helpful. And when you talked about life experience, you have a compelling life experience. Could you talk a little bit about who is your role model and what has inspired you along the way to where you have reached in your life?
I would say one of my biggest lights of inspiration is my grandmother, Blanche Andrews. She was a very, very strong, proud Creole woman. Just born and raised in New Orleans, in Louisiana. My grandmother was the matriarch of our family. My grandfather passed away when my grandmother's children were only teens. This was like in the 60s. And so when you think about this woman who worked as a dietitian, an educated woman who worked as a dietitian, who was very connected to the Catholic Church. She worked for the Archdiocese. She worked for a group of nuns. She prepared their meals. She did the meal planning. And so when I think about those humble beginnings and how she could stretch a meal and just how proud she was in doing it herself, I think that's what helps me identify the most with the Midwest is just this grit of fighting for what's right, doing it yourself, very humble beginnings, not looking for a handout. It taught me to never ask for help. And I say that as a point of inspiration. Some people may think it's contradictory because I say otherwise in my TEDx, but that helped me see another side of humanity, that some people have been so broken and so programmed that even when you're dying, even when you're going without, to not say that you need help. I think that was inspiring because as now a food banking leader, I can take that experience. I can take my mother's experience. I can take my neighbor's experience. I can take my own personal lived experience and bring that into the solutions that we're now applying within the food system. And so I could have said Gwendolyn Brooks was my inspiration, but no, I'd have to say it was my grandmother, because not only did she bring her faith, she brought her full self into everything that she did. And I'm proud that in this space, I can bring my full self as a mom, as a Black woman, as a leader, as an entrepreneur into this food banking space. That's why I do this. It wasn't the 30-year-old Martin Luther King. It wasn't the 40-year-old Malcolm X. It wasn't the 30-year-old or 60-year-old John Lewis.
Right.
It was them as young adults, young teenagers. And it comes from the planting of the seeds today that grow these wild, beautiful flowers that will lead and carry the day. And that's what we need to be doing. What did Whitney Houston say? I believe the children are the future. Mm-hmm. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Show them all the beauty they possess inside.
Yeah.
Give them a sense of pride.
Mm.
That's what we're doing.
Those are powerful words. And I think as a mother of kids, I'm here sitting and asking myself if I'm letting my kids bring their true authentic selves and show up in their true authentic selves to the world. Because like you said, it's that unique trait that each of us possess that is the change that we're designed to be. But I think as society, culturally, for different reasons, systemic reasons, we try to mold to fit in a certain way. And doesn't mean it's bad. It's just out of a fear of not fitting in or not being able to function within society or societal norms and rules. And it's just refreshing to keep being reminded that we have to show up in our authentic self. So thank you for sharing.
Alex, Ashwin, I feel like this is just a warm-up session. Because us not bringing our authentic self serves no one, right? I think for me, just a quick testimony, for me, growing up in the South and being a product of a level of a welfare system, whether it was free or reduced lunch, for temporarily being on food stamps, being raised by a single parent, only receiving disability. I mean, there's a bucket that was created especially for me, that this is how I'm going to turn out in life. And I created this whole new identity and way of being in a strong suit to say, that is not going to be me. Not only is that not going to be me, but I'm going to bury that story. And that never happened. And it wasn't until 6 years ago that I was able to acknowledge that that was my humble beginning, and that was my very real food story. And that no wonder why I have a hungering and a pull to relate and connect to community, because I was community. And it wasn't until I allowed myself to go back to that experience that the authentic me was reborn. And boy, what a world, and a shift in thinking and seeing things. And it was definitely humble to say, girl, you haven't always arrived, okay? And you still haven't arrived. Let's remember.
Yeah.
And so that way of being just increased my empathy and my compassion in ways that I didn't think I allowed myself before.
We definitely need to have another session sometime. Maybe have representation matters. No, I'm serious, and I think we should probably have that topic. Bring you and maybe a few other panelists and really talk about representation matters and let that be the thing.
Representation matters. That's why I intentionally have a little Black girl with really big hair to say that regardless of how you look, like, you need to bring it. And especially for young Black girls, I know as a Black woman, I constantly looked up to those, those figures, those really strong women in our society. I had Claire Huxtable. I looked to. I had Maxine Waters. I
Mm,
had the stories of Fannie Lou Hamer. I had all of these very powerful Black women who I now stand on the shoulders of. And I feel like plenty of times, I don't know what Black woman is coming out and speaking inside of me, because I feel like they, although I didn't personally know them,
Yeah.
their ways of being are so much ingrained in who I am and help to shape me. And I think as a Black woman in America, I'm constantly searching for space. I'm constantly looking for a place to land, because I think in the media, me growing up, if it wasn't for the Huxtables, A Different World, then Sister, then Moesha, I did not have anyone who looked like me. So outside of my immediate circle, in my immediate family, I did not know what this could look like. But on the other side, there's always society telling me that I didn't belong how I should be. I was too loud. I needed to straighten my hair. And so I think as a grown woman, there are parts of me that I realize still relate to that 7-year-old, that 9-year-old, that 15-year-old. And as a grown woman, now a mother of a child, I am giving myself permission to create my own joy, to create my own space unabashed, which is so important. And for any little girl, whether she be Black, Puerto Rican, Asian American, I mean, whoever, just know that you no longer have to look for a place in this world and that you belong.
yeah.
Do not let them put you in a box. Do not let them make you think that you have to change anything about yourself, because it's that which you're being forced to change that will be the change that we've always been looking for, but that we didn't know that we needed.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that story.
Mm-hmm.
Maimunat,
Yeah, no, I think I just also want to echo Ashwin. That has been really inspiring. And I think that's actually the perfect way to round this up, is bringing our authentic selves to work and everything we do. And I think I also really also want to highlight the platinum rule, like you said. We probably need to just have that trademarked or something that it belongs to you, about like treating others as they need to be treated, not necessarily as we want to be treated. Because I think that is when we really provide solutions that are contextualized for individual needs. I think before I hand it over to you to close, Ashwin, a lot of our audience across the spectrum, from practitioners to students, globally, locally, would probably want to follow you on social media, you know, listen to your TED Talk. So do you mind sharing your social media handles and how they can reach you?
Thank you. You can reach me at just Healthy Food Movement on Instagram, Healthy Food Movement on Facebook, and Rayna Andrews, Rayna Andrews, on Instagram.
Thank you. Ashwin, over to you.
sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rayna, for taking the time today to talk to us. It was enlightening, amazing, and informative for us. And I'm certainly sure that it will be the same for our viewers as well. It has been an engaging conversation, and we hope to invite you again to talk in the future about the changes and developments from time to time. And we really thank you so much for being a part of this conversation with public health in real life. And I will leave it to Maimuna to round it off.
Yeah, just echoing Ashwin, thank you so much for lending your time and expertise, Rayna, to this course. And we know our target audience, we have definitely benefited a lot, and we've been educated, and we know our target audience would as well. We'll share all the resources you've shared with us, and we hope to be able to connect with you again sometime. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for your time, your interest, and I enjoy hanging out with you guys. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I couldn't think of it at the time. to spend, and with you all right now, I hope this goes far and wide. My biggest hope in planting the seed is that someone will hear it, be inspired by it, and take this work just one step further.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Have a good night.
Thank you so much, Rayna. You take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.